Yeah, a new report is showing that the CEOs of the top 100 companies are paying the lowest wages. Yeah, the lowest wages made on average of $601 for every $1 earned by the average worker. That was last year in terms of executive compensation records, as we saw that in the C-suite, well, the income continued to climb to record highs. We know this per The Guardian. The Institute for Policy Studies singles out which 100 companies in the S&P 500 pay their workers the least. Companies the report dubs the low-wage 100. These companies pay their employees, including workers outside of the US and part-time workers, a median wage of $31,672 in 2022, while their CEOs took home an average of $15.3 million. Many of these companies also invest millions each year in stock buybacks when a company buys shares of its own stock as a way to boost stock prices and give more money to shareholders. Of the low-wage 190 companies conducted stock buybacks, spending a collective $341.2 billion buying their own shares from January 2020 to May 2023. Now, this report, which is unfortunately not shocking, but it is very bothersome. Well, it highlights the companies that really stood out in the group, of course, including those with the highest paid CEOs and the largest stock buyback. Are you ready for this? Live Nation CEO Michael Rapino had the largest compensation of the group, raking in $139 million in 2022. Meanwhile, the median pay for the company last year was $25,000. Of the companies that had stock buybacks, Lowe's spent the most, dedicating almost $35 billion to its own shares over the last 3 years. Lowe's CEO Marvin Ellison had a compensation of $17.5 million in 2022, while the median worker pay was $30,000. Last I checked, I think that's below the poverty line. Either way, it's not something a lot of people can live on, and nor should they if they're particularly working full-time jobs, while their CEOs are working what, super yachts? Now, Sarah Anderson, the report's lead author, said that the highlights here are that it's highlighting a massive problem with corporate America. So she said this is a really hard data that reinforces what is the major story in corporate America. Instead of investing in their workforce or investment to be competitive, in the long term, they've been putting out huge sums to enrich their CEOs and their shareholders. These are sums that workers at these companies could not even wrap their minds around. Oh my goodness, Brett, let's just pause there and kind of take it in before we talk about potential ways to maybe curb this. But it just seems like the wage gap, it is getting even worse. And it's in part because we're seeing efforts like this where employees are not being paid a living wage, and yet CEOs are filling their coffers without regard at all.
Yeah, I love that Live Nation their CEO is like the poster boy for this kind of stuff, because that's something that really embodies why the corporate structure in America has gone insane and how. So Live Nation, I don't know if this is the Live Nation CEO or the Live Nation Entertainment CEO, but there was essentially, and if they're different, but Live Nation and Ticketmaster merged and created Live Nation Entertainment. And as we all know, we love our Taylor Swift. We love going to concerts now that everybody's kind of crawling out from after COVID to try their hand at whether they will get sick at a live event. But everybody knows that that's like the worst experience. The CEO makes his money by making our lives as the consumer miserable and more expensive, not because they have a superior product, but because they seize and form a barrier between you and the thing you want to do, and then just try to milk as much money out of you as possible, not by making it better or doing any kind of competition, but by merging, eliminating the competition, creating essentially a monopoly on live events, and then raking in money as a reward for making life miserable. And a lot of these companies end up needing assistance anyway. So they say that this is a free market that we live in. It's not, because what ends up happening is the CEOs pay their employees less than a living wage. And because those employees make less than a living wage, those employees then, gainfully employed people who have been told to get a job, loser, They get a job, that job doesn't pay enough, and then they have to go on government assistance, which means that every bit of business that Live Nation and all these top 100 lowest paying CEO companies do, all of that, they're getting paid a ton of money, and that's being subsidized by you and me, the taxpayer. Something that a lot of us complain about. A lot of them, more specifically, loudly complain about. And then, the line is, it's rugged individualism for the poor and socialism for the rich. This list absolutely proves that. Most of these companies get government subsidies that make it so that their CEOs can get these golden parachutes when they leave, and champagne and caviar dreams while they're still in their jobs.
Yes, and it's so incredibly sad because we see this happen again and again and again. And this whole living wage thing, it's a thought that this is something that you cannot attain. And so you end up with individuals having to take on multiple jobs, also individuals having to take on multiple debt so that they can really keep their heads afloat. And the thing is it's not sustainable. So you have to ask yourself, at what point does the federal government have to get involved? And so we know this from Common Dreams. IPS found that 51 of the companies in the low wage 100, including Amazon, FedEx, and Johnson Controls, received a combined 24.1 billion worth of federal contracts between fiscal years 2020 and 2023, potentially giving the federal government leverage to force the companies to rein in out of control executive compensation and stock buybacks. As part of a menu of proposed policy solutions, IPS urged President Biden's administration to give federal contractors that don't repurchase their own shares priority in the awarding of subsidies and grants, a move that would build on a policy the US Commerce Department enacted last year for semiconductor subsidies. The group also called on federal lawmakers to pass legislation to impose higher taxes on companies with yawning gaps between CEO and worker pay. In 2021, Senator Bernie Sanders proposed a bill that would have hiked taxes on large corporations that pay their top executives over 50 times more than their median workers. Absolutely. You would think that that is the bare minimum that the federal government could do to try to rein in a lot of this disparity in pay, knowing that it's not sustainable for the United States in the long run. But unfortunately, we don't have a government that operates to serve the people as opposed to serve corporations. Brett, any last closing things or words on this?
Just those gaps. There's so many gaps in America that are really indicators that the system is out of control. And that wage gap between CEOs and the average employee is a huge one. That is a giant indicator, and that gap has gotten larger and larger over time. And I think a lot of people, there's this weird argument that right wingers who are corporatists make. They're like, listen, if you make it more expensive for me to run my business, I'm gonna hire fewer people and I'm gonna find some other thing to do with my life. I call BS. They're there because they wanna make the most money possible. If we throttle how much the highest amount possible is, they're still gonna try to achieve that by some means or another. They're gonna find some way or some loophole around the system, and we just have to keep closing those loopholes.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.